The snow fell in thick silence, burying the narrow mountain path under a layer of white that swallowed every trace of the world before. The wind howled low, like something mourning. Trees bent under the weight of frost, their limbs groaning as if they too had grown tired of standing. Somewhere in that frozen wilderness, a man walked alone. His coat was worn, his boots cracked from years of labor, and his beard was dusted with snow. The man, known only as Tobias Gray, moved with the kind of weight carried by those who no longer had anyone waiting at home. His cabin lay deep in the woods, far from the town he once called his own, and even farther from the people who no longer spoke his name. He had buried his wife and son 2 winters ago, the fever taking them both within days, and since then he had lived like a ghost among trees, speaking only to the fire and sometimes the wind when it came quiet. He was returning from checking the traps when he heard the first scream. Not loud, not close, but sharp enough to freeze his breath mid-step. He paused, every instinct sharpened by solitude. Another cry followed, shriller this time, and clearly from a child. Tobias turned, following the sound downhill through the trees, his rifle ready. The snow made the going slow, but the cries led him straight to a clearing near the old creek bed. There, stumbling through knee-deep drifts, was a woman, bareheaded, her coat half-torn, arms clutching 2 bundled figures tight to her chest. Her eyes were wild with fear, and behind her, shadows moved fast through the trees. Wolves. 3 of them, lean and hungry, their eyes glowing in the twilight. The lead one lunged, teeth bared, but Tobias raised his rifle and fired without hesitation. The shot cracked through the air like a whip, and the beast dropped. The others flinched, then fled into the trees. The woman collapsed before Tobias reached her, the children still in her arms. He dropped to his knees, checking first that she was breathing, then that the children, both girls, no older than 3, were alive. They whimpered softly, but they were warm. The woman's face was pale, lips cracked, eyes fluttering with exhaustion. She had no strength left. Tobias didn't ask questions. He lifted her carefully, balancing the children across his shoulders, and began the long walk back to his cabin. Snow fell heavier now, the world closing in. By the time he pushed open the cabin door, his legs burned and his fingers ached from cold. He laid the woman down on his cot, placed the children near the fire, and stoked it higher until the room glowed with warmth. He worked in silence, removing the woman's soaked boots, wrapping the children in dry blankets, setting a kettle to boil. It wasn't until much later, when the woman stirred and opened her eyes, that Tobias finally saw what she carried beneath her fear, something familiar. The hollow look of someone who had lost everything and had no name left to call their own. Her name was Cora. He found it written inside a worn leather pouch she carried, along with a scrap of paper bearing only a single line, "They will never stop hunting me." The handwriting was desperate, the ink smeared as if from tears or rain. Tobias didn't press her. In the days that followed, Cora said little. She barely ate, slept only when the girls did, and flinched at every noise outside. The girls were named Lily and May, though Tobias only learned that after one of them cried it out in sleep. The cabin was small, 1 room and a loft, but he gave them space, choosing instead to sleep on the floor beside the hearth while they took the cot. Cora began to heal slowly, her bruises fading, the color returning to her cheeks. Still, she kept her eyes low and her voice quieter than the wind. The girls adapted quickly, drawn to the warmth and the rhythm of the place. They played near the fire, followed Tobias when he went to chop wood, and often fell asleep in his lap as he sat carving wooden animals from scrap. The silence between him and Cora began to change, not disappear, but shift into something less painful. He noticed how she watched him from the corner of her eye when she thought he wasn't looking, how she touched the wooden animals gently, almost reverently. One night, after the girls had fallen asleep and the fire had burned low, Cora sat beside him and whispered, not with fear, but memory. She told him bits of what had happened. Her husband had died in a logging accident the year before. His brothers had promised to help, to take her in, but they had other plans. There was land involved, a small inheritance. The brothers wanted it, and Cora had become an obstacle. They took her in, but made life unbearable. One night, she overheard them planning to sell her daughters off and make it look like an accident. She ran, taking nothing but the girls and the pouch. She had been moving through the woods ever since, hiding, stealing food when she had to, sleeping in barns, behind sheds, under trees. The wolves had been the last of many threats. Tobias said nothing when she finished. He simply nodded and added more wood to the fire. The days passed quietly. Spring teased the edges of the snow, birds returning, the trees waking. Cora began to help around the cabin, mending clothes, cleaning tools, even venturing to the river to help with traps. Her hands were steady, her silence no longer hollow but calm. The girls bloomed in the safety of the place, and so, slowly, did she. Tobias found himself watching her more often, not with want, but with wonder. The strength she held under all that pain. He hadn't thought it possible to care for anyone again, not after his own loss had carved a hollow in him so deep it echoed. But Cora filled it without trying. She simply was, and that was enough. One morning, Tobias returned from town with supplies. He didn't go often, only when necessary. This time he brought flour, salt, and a small bolt of blue fabric. He handed it to Cora without words, and she took it with tears rising in her eyes. She hadn't worn anything new in years. That night she stitched it into a dress, her fingers moving slowly, remembering how to create something for herself. But happiness, Tobias knew, was always temporary. It never stayed long, especially not in places where shadows knew your name. The first sign came in the form of a stranger on the ridge. A man on horseback, watching the cabin from a distance, not moving. Tobias spotted him while out chopping wood. He said nothing to Cora, but that night he kept the rifle closer. The next day, a note was nailed to a tree near the trail. No name, just 3 words. "We found you." Tobias burned it without showing her, but she knew anyway. Her eyes told him everything. The fear had returned. That night, they didn't speak, but they sat closer than ever before. It was 2 days later when the men came. 3 of them, rough, mean-eyed, and wearing the same smug certainty he remembered from the worst kind of people. They knocked, loud and slow. Tobias opened the door with the rifle in hand, his face cold as the snow outside. They claimed they were there to collect what belonged to them. Claimed Cora was mentally unwell, that she had stolen from her husband's family, that the girls were not safe with her. Tobias didn't flinch. He told them the land wasn't theirs to claim, that if they took one step closer, they'd answer for it. The men left, but not far. They set up camp near the creek, waiting. Cora begged Tobias to run, to take the girls and go, or let her go alone. He refused. He'd lost a family once and wouldn't stand by while someone tried to take another. That night, wolves howled in the distance, but it wasn't them he feared. It was the wolves dressed as men, waiting in the dark. And in the morning, everything changed. The morning began too quiet. Not even the birds sang. Tobias noticed it first, the unnatural stillness in the woods, the air thick like a warning. He moved cautiously around the cabin, checking the traps, watching the tree line. Nothing. No movement. The firewood stack had been disturbed, one of the logs at the edge knocked loose, the mark of a boot too clean to be his or Cora's. He didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, he asked Cora to keep the girls inside and lock the door. She didn't ask why. She saw it too. The storm was coming, and it wouldn't bring snow. By midday, it was clear the men weren't just waiting, they were hunting. Tobias followed a trail of snapped twigs down to the creek and found one of the men crouched by the water, washing blood from his hand. Tobias raised his rifle. The man looked up and froze, eyes narrowing. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tobias didn't give him the chance. The shot echoed through the trees. The man collapsed, a scream cut short by the cold. That was the warning, and Tobias knew it wouldn't stop them. He raced back to the cabin, heart pounding. When he arrived, the door was open. The girls were crying. Cora was gone. He found May near the fireplace, sobbing, her sister curled against her. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just Cora's shawl, left behind. Tobias wrapped the girls in blankets, strapped on his gear, and loaded the rifle. They'd taken her while he was gone. Men allured him out, force a trade, use her to break him. But they didn't know him. They didn't know that Tobias Gray had buried more than a wife and a child. He had buried the man he used to be, and what had risen from that grief was something colder, harder, and far more dangerous. He tracked them to the ridge. The trail was easy to follow, heavy boots, the occasional torn thread snagged on a branch. They were not subtle. They didn't have to be. They believed she was helpless, that Tobias would trade silence for safety. They didn't understand what it meant to owe someone your life. Cora had given him purpose again, taken the weight of loneliness and made it bearable. And she brought him Lily and May's small, bright flames in the long dark of his life. He wouldn't let them burn. When he found the camp, dusk was setting. Cora sat tied to a post near the fire, bruised but upright. Her eyes met his the moment he crouched behind a fallen tree. No sound passed between them, but she shook her head just slightly. Don't. But Tobias didn't listen. He moved through the trees like smoke. The first man fell with a silent slash of the knife, dropped before he could draw breath. The second heard the body and turned too late. The rifle spoke once, and the firelight caught the red blooming across his chest. The third man, the leader, grabbed Cora by the throat and dragged her close, shouting into the dark. You come out now, or she dies. Tobias stepped from the trees, rifle aimed. Let her go. The man laughed. You shoot. She dies. Tobias lowered the gun, just a fraction, just enough. The man sneered, pulled a blade, and that's when Cora moved. Fast, with the fury of a mother who's had enough. She slammed her head back into his nose, the crack sharp and wet. He stumbled, howling, and Tobias didn't wait. He fired once, clean. The man dropped, gurgling. The woods fell silent again. Cora slumped against the post. Tobias ran to her, cutting the ropes. She didn't cry. She just leaned into him, and for the first time, he felt her body soften, not in fear, but in trust. They didn't speak on the walk back. The woods, once threatening, now felt still and wide, like they had swallowed the violence whole and moved on. Back at the cabin, the girls ran to her, crying, clinging. She knelt, pulled them into her arms, and whispered their names like prayers. Tobias watched from the doorway, rifle still in hand. He knew peace never lasted. Not truly. But this was a moment worth holding. The next day, they buried the bodies deep in the woods. No markers, no words. Tobias didn't believe in revenge, but he believed in ending things. Cora changed after that. Not broken, stronger. Her eyes clearer, her shoulders straighter. She began to talk more, share memories of her husband, what little love had once existed, and the way it had all unraveled. She told Tobias about her childhood, about dreams she'd buried. And he listened. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to know every corner of the woman who had survived so much and still managed to love. Spring deepened. The cabin filled with small joys. Cora planted herbs near the back window. Tobias built a second cradle, stronger, bigger. The girls began to walk, then run. They laughed now, freely. Even Cora laughed, quietly at first, then louder. Tobias never asked her to stay. She did anyway. She started calling the cabin home. She took over his old coat, sewed new patches into it, stitched flowers into the lining. One night, when the girls were asleep and the fire burned low, she reached across the table and took his hand. It wasn't a promise. It was a beginning. But nothing in life comes easy. A month after the last snowfall melted, a rider arrived. This time it wasn't a hunter, but a man in a fine coat with polished boots. He claimed to be Cora's late husband's cousin. Said he had legal claim over the family estate. That a woman like Cora, a runaway and a widow with children, couldn't possibly be trusted to manage land or raise girls alone. He produced papers full of seals and signatures. Claimed he would be taking the girls. Cora didn't speak. Tobias stood beside her and told the man to leave. But he didn't. The next week, a letter arrived from the county seat. A summons. A hearing. A decision to be made by strangers with no knowledge of truth. They packed the wagon and made the journey. Cora wore the blue dress. Tobias wore his old Sunday coat, dusty but neat. The girls rode between them, quiet but smiling. They didn't know the stakes, not really. The town was bigger than Tobias remembered. More people, more eyes. They arrived early and waited outside the courthouse, hand in hand. Inside, it went exactly as Tobias feared. The cousin painted Cora as unstable, irresponsible, violent. Claimed Tobias was her captor, not her protector. Claimed the girls deserved better. Then Cora spoke. She told them everything. Not with tears, but with steel in her voice. She told of the abuse, the fear, the escape. She told of the wolves and the night she almost died. She told of Tobias, of how he had saved her, not just with a rifle, but with kindness. She ended with this. He didn't rescue a woman in need. He stood beside one who had already chosen to survive. The judge listened, then asked Tobias to speak. He did, simply. She gave me my life back. I won't let anyone take hers. The ruling came in silence. Full custody awarded to Cora. Charges dismissed. Papers voided. As they stepped from the courthouse, townsfolk watched, unsure whether to judge or respect what they had seen. It didn't matter. Tobias helped her into the wagon. She pulled the girls close. They rode back toward the woods, toward the home they had built, not from ownership, but from love. That night, under the stars, Tobias knelt in the dirt beside the garden and asked if she would marry him. She didn't answer with words. She just kissed him. The wolves were gone. The shadows had passed. But the fire between them burned steady. And finally, it was enough. The summer that followed their marriage was golden and strange. The land seemed to breathe easier, as if it too had been waiting for something gentle to return. Tobias and Cora planted potatoes, corn, and beans in tidy rows. The girls chased butterflies through tall grass and giggled like songbirds. Even the wind seemed warmer, kinder. But peace is always borrowed, never owned. And it rarely stays long enough to get comfortable. The first sign came when a letter arrived by courier, not from the county, but from Tobias's own family. His sister's name was inked neatly on the outside, Ruth Gray, followed by a request, not warm but precise. Come visit and bring your wife. The letter made no mention of Cora's name. Tobias stared at it for a long time before placing it on the mantel. He hadn't spoken to Ruth or the rest of his kin since the funeral, and even before then, their love had been more obligation than affection. Cora saw his jaw tighten, but didn't ask. Instead, she simply said, "If you go, I go." And so they went. They left the girls with a kind neighbor for the day, a widow named Marnie who'd taken a liking to Lily and May during a recent trading post run. Cora kissed the girls softly and whispered that she'd be back before nightfall. The ride into town was long and hot. Dust clung to the wheels, and birds circled in silence overhead. Tobias didn't speak much. Neither did Cora. There was an unease riding with them in the wagon, something just under the surface. When they arrived, Ruth was waiting on the porch of the family homestead, arms crossed tight. She looked the same but smaller somehow, like time had shrunk her down and hardened what was left. Behind her stood Tobias's uncle, Thomas Gray, stern and sharp-eyed, wearing the same scowl he'd worn at the funeral. Ruth greeted them with a nod, her eyes landing on Cora like she was something pulled from a river. They sat stiff around the dining table, the same one where Tobias had once carved his name in secret under the edge. Ruth served coffee, barely warm. Cora thanked her, polite but unreadable. The conversation began with pleasantries but turned cold quickly. Ruth asked how long they planned to keep playing house. Thomas asked if the girls were really Tobias's, or if Cora was just another widow looking to latch onto land and a name. The words stung more than Cora let on. She didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened around the handle of her cup. Tobias kept his voice steady. "She's my wife. They're my daughters. You don't get to question that." But Ruth did question it. She brought up bloodlines. Inheritance. The fact that the Gray land, technically, still listed Tobias and Ruth both as heirs. She implied Cora's presence could complicate things. "All I'm saying," Ruth concluded, "is you should think long and hard before tying your name to someone with baggage like hers." Cora stood then. Not abruptly. Slowly, with dignity. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "But my daughters aren't baggage. And I don't need your name. I carry my own just fine." She walked out. Tobias followed. The ride back was silent again, but this time it hummed with something deeper. Not just anger, but clarity. Tobias reached across the seat and took her hand. She let him. When they reached the cabin, the girls ran to greet them, but Cora scooped them into her arms and didn't let go for a long time. That night, Tobias burned the letter from Ruth. He didn't say anything while it turned to ash, and Cora didn't ask. But the next day, she stitched a new name into the girls' shawls, Gray. It should have ended there, but it didn't. 2 weeks later, word came from town. Ruth had petitioned the county to challenge the inheritance, claiming Tobias was unfit to manage the land while under the undue influence of an outsider. Cora's name wasn't on the document, but it didn't need to be. The meaning was clear. If Ruth succeeded, the land could be seized. Their home could be taken. The life they built, erased by signatures. They could have run, packed up the girls, taken the wagon, and vanished deeper into the wilderness. But Cora refused. "I've run enough," she said. "If we keep running, they win every time." Tobias agreed. They traveled back to the county seat, this time as a family. The courthouse was the same, but everything else felt different. There were no tears, no fear. Only resolve. Cora wore her blue dress again. Tobias wore his best coat. The girls clung to their hands, eyes wide. Inside, Ruth sat at the front, flanked by a lawyer and Uncle Thomas. She didn't look at Tobias when he entered. The judge, a tall man with weathered eyes, read through the documents with a sigh. "So," he said slowly, "we're here to question whether a man living peacefully on land he's worked for years has lost his senses because he dared to remarry?" Ruth's lawyer stood, made his case, spoke of legal gray areas, technicalities, family tradition. Tobias didn't speak. He just watched. And then the judge turned to him. Tobias stepped forward and began to speak, not as a man defending his land, but as one defending his life. He spoke of his son, of the cold nights alone. He spoke of Cora, of how she'd arrived with nothing but the will to survive. He spoke of the wolves, of the men who had hunted her, and the quiet strength she carried every single day. He said nothing about love, because he didn't have to. It was visible in every word. Then Cora stepped forward. She didn't speak about pain this time. She spoke about hope. She spoke about the garden, the cradle Tobias built, the way May laughed when Tobias lifted her in the air, how Lily now ran barefoot through the fields, fearless. She ended with one sentence: "I didn't come to take anything. I came to rebuild." The room was still. The judge dismissed the challenge. Ruth stood slowly and left without a word. Thomas followed, scowling. Outside, the air smelled like rain. Cora looked at Tobias and smiled. Not big. Just enough. They returned home that night. The sky cracked open with thunder, and the rain came hard, drumming on the roof like a song only they understood. The girls danced in it, shrieking with joy, and Cora let them. Tobias stood in the doorway watching, arms crossed, heart full. Seasons changed. Leaves turned gold, then fell. Snow returned. The cabin stood strong. Years passed. The girls grew. Lily became bold and bright, always asking questions. May softer, thoughtful, but with a steel edge. Cora taught them how to braid rope, mend a shirt, stand their ground. Tobias taught them how to shoot, how to track deer, how to build a fire that would last through the worst kind of night. One day, Cora found an old letter buried in a drawer, something she had written when she first arrived. A goodbye she never sent. She read it once, then placed it in the fire. She didn't need it anymore. On their 10th anniversary, Tobias carved a bench and placed it under the apple tree behind the cabin. Cora sat on it each morning with coffee and watched the sunrise, the girls running in the distance. Tobias joined her when he could. They didn't always speak. They didn't need to. And when the time came, years later, when the wind blew cold and Tobias's beard had turned white, he passed quietly in his sleep, hands still wrapped around hers. Cora held it until dawn. She buried him beneath the apple tree. The girls stood beside her, strong and grown. They didn't cry. They sang. Cora stayed in the cabin until her hair turned silver. The girls married, built homes nearby. Grandchildren ran the same trails Lily and May once had. And each night, Cora lit the fire with hands that had once trembled but now only carried peace. Sometimes she'd sit on the bench beneath the tree, close her eyes, and remember the wolves, the snow, the man who didn't ask for anything but gave her everything. And she'd whisper, "We made it." And in the wind, in the fire, in the roots of the tree, his love always answered. They had not just survived. They had bloomed.